Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Converge and B-Sides Detroit Virtual Conference 2020 edition. Today we have our first speaker and keynote speaker, Matt Graeber. Matt, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. All right. So this talk is a result of a lot of introspection I've done about the offensive tools and techniques I've released. And it's also the result of feeling an obligation to attempt to bring our industry closer together, who I've seen in some respects grow increasingly polarized. But first of all, I wanted to acknowledge you, those of you who are watching or reading these slides later on. If you are watching this, I want to acknowledge you and thank you for spending your valuable time with me. I also want to acknowledge the sacrifice you've made throughout this extremely challenging year. The fact that you're here right now, the fact that you're right here right now is an accomplishment worthy of respect. And I think you really should pat yourself on the back and show some respect to yourself for your resilience and patience. So who am I? My name is Matt. Just very briefly about myself, I would consider myself a defender with an attacker's mindset, who has a lengthy history of releasing offensive tools and techniques. So why do I have defender and attacker highlighted? Well, language matters. And when it comes to chipping away at divisiveness and polarization in our industry and just in general, I think we have to be mindful of the labels we apply to ourselves and to others. For example, by me labeling myself, I'm attempting to project a certain image of myself that I feel as though I'm in control of. For example, in the case of conference presentations, the desired image to project is that of confidence and authority on the subject that's being presented. Ultimately, you'll be the judge, but by labeling myself as a defender and attacker, I'm trying to project that I could perhaps be a trustworthy authority on both offense and defense, presumably minimizing the likelihood of me being a hypocrite and maximizing my relatability to the subject and you, everyone who's watching this. But again, you are ultimately the judge of that. And I've also highlighted lengthy in the second bullet there, really just wanting to highlight this choice of word to perhaps attempt to have you consider that I am an authority on this subject. But again, you are the judge of that, not me. So how did we get here today? So I'm here today because I could feel that the temperature among some aspects of our industry is a little higher than I'm comfortable with. And so this is my attempt to lower that temperature just slightly. So here's my personal perspective on the current state of divisiveness among or at least aspects of our industry. So an otherwise important message about offensive security tools and techniques has been delivered in an often abrasive, insulting, and judgmental manner, resulting in increased polarization. I feel as though we are arbitrarily further apart than we are close. I've seen the term offensive security tools was appropriated. Because offensive security tools was more or less coined as an official term by someone who people tend to have strong feelings about, whether positive or negative, they are associated with that person, hence appropriated. I'm deliberately not using the term misappropriated though, because who am I to judge proper or improper appropriation of a term? Lastly, I see a decreased willingness to find solutions as a result of a perception that one side would unilaterally bear responsibility to address a problem, right? So where's the motivation to fix the problem when you feel like you're having a finger constantly wagged in your face? Now I want to highlight the distinction I'm making here between the message and the particular delivery of the message. I think the distinction is important because I think an opportunity always exists to consider the two separately. My personal feeling is that despite what I consider to be a poor delivery, in this case the underlying message about the harm facilitated by offensive security tools is absolutely fair game for consideration. So I'm here today, in spite of all this, as someone who has a history of releasing offensive tools and techniques, a history of immaturity, and subsequent improvements in my maturity, slowly but surely, and someone who is responsible for improving detection coverage, and someone who has seen firsthand on countless occasions how his tools and techniques are used to facilitate harm. So this brings me to rule number 1. I'll sprinkle these throughout the presentation to reinforce some of the concepts we covered. A poor delivery of a message doesn't have to negate the potential value of the underlying message. So emphasis on doesn't have to negate. So again, here I want to distinguish the message from its delivery. And we'll talk about ways to improve both the delivery of the message and our reception of messages. So the better we can communicate a message, the more it will naturally be received by its intended audience. And the better we learn to receive a message, despite its poor delivery, the better we can become at reducing our reactivity to the message, and as a result, an improved ability to consider the underlying message more clearly, more sincerely, and more compassionately. So first, some assumptions. This talk is built upon a foundation of assumptions where I believe there is value to be derived if and only if you, the listener or reader, and I can agree on the following assumptions. Without offensive tools and techniques being made public, I would argue that defenders would never be in a position to have an upper hand, and they would remain largely reactive to threats. Now, throughout this talk, you'll see certain words or phrases underlined and italicized. I do this to highlight deliberate uses of language that I may or may not speak to directly. A recurring theme of this talk is that the language we use is extremely important, and when used in a deliberate fashion, can be effective at minimizing ambiguity, confusion, misunderstandings, or perceptions of insults. Because an offensive security tool or technique is useful to an offensive security professional, it automatically exhibits the potential to be useful to criminals. Now, assuming we are ethical security professionals, it doesn't matter what, quote, side of the spectrum we're on, we should all want to improve security, right? But how can we transform want, i.e., a declaration of an aspiration to improve security, to actual action? All right. Again, an aspiration to reduce evil is honorable, but are we willing to do something if afforded the opportunity? Lastly, we generally all take pride in our work. It's only natural, because otherwise what reason would we have to continue doing it? But the pride we have can be an asset or a liability depending upon how our pride influences our decision making. A potential liability if the above assumptions are not taken into consideration. An asset if the above considerations are taken into consideration. All right, so ultimately, who is this talk for, and what is the agenda? So this is for anyone who's open to strategies for improving our collective conduct on social media, and strategies for thinking about ways that we can go about improving our offensive security tools and technique releases. Now, I also want to be very clear that I have nothing to offer you here to agree or disagree with. That's my opinion, at least. These are merely perspectives, observations, and recommendations that you can either take to heart or not. People will often say, my goal is that if I can get through to at least one person, then I have achieved my objective. Well, obviously, I would love that. I like to propose a supplementary goal where if one person leaves this talk extremely confused, angered, or having less respect for me, I have achieved my objective if they channel that into something productive and ultimately positive. So with that, let's talk about our conduct on social media. By the way, if you came to this talk with popcorn, I ask that you please put it down. We'll be minimizing the direct pointing of fingers throughout this. All right, so I'm highlighting the word our in our attempt to assure you that I personally feel a responsibility to always improve my online conduct, not just for the benefit of some, for example, like my children, or for the benefit of those who already share a similar worldview, but for the benefit of all, arguably especially for those who have a drastically different perspective than mine. All right, so let's get these out of the way first and not come back to them because I want to spend more time focusing on what does work and is more productive and inclusive than what doesn't work. All right, so first thing that I just outright don't think works is the diminishment or belittlement of others. If this is something that we engage in, what we're doing is implicitly exerting ourselves as an arbitrarily higher authority while explicitly and arbitrarily lowering the authority of the target of our comment. Next, asserting of authority by either enumerating or highlighting our experience on a subject. This is similar to belittlement, but rather here we're explicitly elevating ourselves as an authority while implicitly lowering others. Lastly, name calling. Like, seriously, what grade are we in? Like, this is unnecessary. So there's two themes I'm trying to highlight here. The first, who are you and who am I to elevate myself above someone else? Pretty much everyone but myself in the moment can see right through that crap, assuming it's me who's engaging in that. Second, speech that comes from a place of emotion or passion that is not mindfully considered has a tendency to come out as very childish. In my opinion, childish being a relative and somewhat unfair label to the many children who I've met who are far more mindful and considerate than many adults out there. So as you're reading this, if you're thinking, great, I bet Matt's talking about me, am I? If so, you likely already know the answer. And if you're reading this and you're saying, ooh, I know exactly who he's talking about, I would argue that you don't. I'm talking about you. Try to use this opportunity to not exclude yourself from criticism. And lastly, you may now be thinking, what are you, Matt, somehow above all of this? The answer is unequivocally no. The fact is, we're all guilty of this, and the better we get at catching ourselves in the act and learning from our past mistakes, the less likely we are to engage in this kind of conduct in the future. The quicker we can apologize and forgive ourselves when we inevitably engage in this conduct, and the more forgiving we will be of others who engage in this poor conduct. So if there's one lesson that I really want to get out there from this talk, it's that the language that we use matters. And what I'm about to offer you is a strategy that I've employed for some time now that I find to be extremely effective at delivering a message in a way that doesn't have a tendency to trigger egos quite as much. And so it allows the person receiving our message to be much more naturally receptive to it, because that default ego trigger response doesn't get in the way of otherwise openness or rational thinking. So let's talk about what I'm coining as separation nouns. So these are words that tend to separate the speaker from the audience. All right. So this could mean the difference between judging someone or feeling as though you're being judged, taking offense at something, and being more receptive to our message. So for example, The pronouns you, they, them, or like the noun people all exhibit a potential for judgment. Versus if we consider replacing those with pronouns like we or our, you could consider that, you could like reframe your message as if it's a call for collective responsibility. Now we could also consider replacing those pronouns with I, which comes off as more introspective. So here's an example here. You have failed at, just complete that sentence, and pretty much any reasonable person out there who has any kind of feelings is going to feel threatened by that sentence. Versus if you simply replace you with we, it has a different tone, almost like there's that call for collective responsibility. Versus I have failed at, like I am holding myself accountable. So if we're talking about a perceived industry-wide failure in this case, if we agree that the red side and the blue side are not separate from one another, then using we as a pronoun seems appropriate, because even if someone besides myself has failed in my eyes, then we are collectively failing. And how are we not collectively all responsible for making things better? So what I'm proposing here is really hard to do initially, but it gets so much easier with time, I promise. So if this is something you're willing to do, my suggestion for practicing this would be to do these things in the following order, of hardest to easiest. So first, if you're leveling a judgment publicly for all to consume, and you're prone to using those separation pronouns, consider replacing them with I as the pronoun. So does your criticism, consider the following. Does your criticism either apply directly to you based on a former mistake you've made, or could you consider framing this as a note to your future self? Now, if that's too hard or if it's just not applicable, rather than explicitly directing the criticism to yourself, you can more implicitly include yourself and explicitly include others as responsible parties by using we as the pronoun. Now, if that's too hard or outright not applicable, you could always consider abstaining from leveling the criticism. This is an opportunity now to consider the necessity of your criticism, or if you really feel that a gross injustice is occurring, warranting the highlighting of misconduct. Lastly, if all else fails, well, I'd argue this isn't necessarily a failure, consider reframing your criticism into a positive message by highlighting someone who exhibits the upstanding conduct you expect to see. This is actually really easy to do, and it has the added benefit of uplifting someone who wasn't expecting it. So I wanted to give you an example of where practicing things like this, so like introspection and falling on your sword, building up to it and executing on it can really hurt, but it can hurt so good. So a little bit of a story. I forget what release of PowerShell. This was like PowerShell Core version 6, like one of the latest versions of open source PowerShell. I noticed for a while that the security mitigations of the open source version were not in parity with the built-in Windows version. And so I tested some bypasses and was like, WTF, like why don't these mitigations apply to the latest and greatest version? One of the PMs on the team, Steve Lee, responded pretty quickly to me and was like, are you sure about that? Because we actually did implement all of these security mitigations, and it was my mistake. I had not updated to the latest version of PowerShell Core 6.2, where a massive investment was made to ensure security feature parity with the built-in Windows version. And so while it was painful to do it, I admitted my mistake, and was premature in my criticism. And shortly thereafter, Jeffrey Snover, if you're not aware, the inventor of PowerShell, a technical fellow at Microsoft, responded and thanked me for my contributions, acknowledging everyone makes mistakes. And so this just made me feel so good. Like it was such a reprieve for how guilty and bad I felt about prematurely claiming that this security feature wasn't in place. Especially me, considering myself to be somewhat of an authority when it comes to PowerShell security. I screwed up, I owned up to it, and the gift that I got from it was Jeffrey Snover profusely thanking me for my contributions. So while it hurt initially, it felt so much better for owning up to my mistake. And this was direct validation of this being the right thing for me to do. All right, so let's consider a practical example of communicating a message in a divisive fashion and discuss what's wrong with it and how we can deliver the same message in a far more productive fashion. All right. So consider the sentence or the criticism. Those in the offensive security community fail to consider the extent to which their releases facilitate and lower the cost of criminal operations. All right, let's highlight some key words here, what I think is poor messaging. All right, so those. There's one of those separation pronouns that serves to separate me, the person criticizing, from the target of my criticism. Next, fail. I'm making a blanket assertion that, quote, those, implying most or all of those in the offensive community are falling short of a responsibility that I am imposing on a group that I consider myself to be separate from. And then facilitate and criminal together. So if I'm receiving this message as someone who releases offensive tools, so what you're saying is that I'm deliberately helping criminals? How dare you insinuate that? So that may not be the intended message, but to me it's reasonable to assume that it could be interpreted as in that fashion. So let's try to rephrase this. Rather than wagging our finger, let's consider a collective proposal for a solution. All right. So can you see how the underlying message here is similar, but the delivery is drastically different and potentially far more productive and inclusive? Let's highlight some of the words here. So we've replaced those separation pronouns with more inclusive pronouns, I and we. So this implies that I am not separate from the problem of criminal adoption of offensive tooling. Next, increasing the cost to criminals. So rather than highlighting that, quote, you are responsible for making things easier for criminals, I highlight the potential for taking responsibility for making things harder for criminals. Next, maximizing value to defenders. Well, who wouldn't want to increase value to defenders? Lastly, here's one way in which Jane Doe is doing that. Here I'm highlighting someone who is actively making things better rather than simply pointing out what's wrong. Here's another way that I see language commonly abused, and this is in frequently calling out hypocrisy. So this all has the effect, from my perspective, of ignoring the criticism or indirectly absolving oneself of personal responsibility. It's a shifting away from solutions toward discrediting someone else, and now we're back to not being a part of a solution. These concepts are otherwise referred to as, quote, whataboutism. Now, I wanted to highlight an example of when things go horribly, horribly wrong. Some of you watching this may be familiar with the hashtag I am enlightened from maybe going on 2 years ago. So background behind this was a former coworker of mine I think had put out some blog post, and then this company had basically like discredited his work and claimed that without any proof that their solution just outright stopped this technique that was being talked about. And so my quote clever response to that was, "This tweet is meaningless and without substance." And from there, things snowballed. It got completely out of control. A large portion of the collective industry kind of piled on to this. Many, quote, came to my defense, which, well, at the time I considered many to come to my defense, considering I consider this to be an attack on me personally, when really I started this crap in the first place. So I want to be very clear that this was my fault, and I take responsibility for my unnecessary and childish response. Everything that followed is a direct result of me starting this in the first place. So there's always a better way to improve how we communicate things if we choose to communicate something in the first place, or we always have the option to abstain from speech. And this is a great example of where I could have just kept my mouth shut. All right, so summarizing all of this, I want to offer you two quotes that I really encourage you to take to heart and consider incorporating into a regular practice. Like, don't just passively read these, but incorporate them into action if you can. So the first, I want to thank Andy Robbins for introducing me to this quote. So the best way to show that a stick is crooked is not to argue about it or to spend time denouncing it, but to lay a straight stick alongside it. So in conducting ourselves online, I see there's like two aspects of it. There are ways in which we can be a better sender and a better receiver. This to me highlights how we can be a better sender or communicator of concepts in a more productive and inclusive fashion. So, should I feel compelled to criticize? This quote regularly encourages me to identify an opportunity to either find a way in which I can exhibit the positive behavior I desire to see, or to amplify the work of someone who's already doing the right thing. While it's easy to criticize, fortunately, it's also easy and more productive in most cases to highlight how others are living by example right now. So I love this quote, and this really helps teach me to be a better receiver of messages, especially ones that come off initially as divisive, that might otherwise have an important message underneath the poor delivery. So between stimulus and response, there's a space. That space is so important. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I want to thank Jeffrey Snover for introducing me to this awesome quote. And in my interpretation of this, no response is included in what compromises a response. No response in the case of where ultimately the speech just doesn't contribute anything of value. I'm not referring to turning away from or ignoring an outright problem, though. All right, so that's it for our personal conduct online. Let's transition into talking about our offensive tool and technique releases. All right. So first, I'd like to establish a foundation before getting into all this. So here's my cheesy red, blue, purple take. But I want to highlight my deliberate choice of words and speak to those. So red and blue are not binary. They comprise a polarity where one cannot exist without the other. They are mutually inclusive. So going on the assumption that red and blue are poles, so there's that polarity there, rather than distinct, quote, sides, the word and was selected over red versus blue because versus implies a binary choice, whereby there's a distinct separation between the two labels, which can plant the seeds of artificial division. So I mainly want to highlight that red is inclusive of blue and blue is inclusive of red. We can't separate the two. We're all in this together. So nothing really shocking here, but I'm asking that you trust me that I don't advocate for one side over another, because I don't see how it's possible to even separate things into two distinct sides. All right, so let's talk about how we may typically justify the tools we release and some of the logical and ethical traps we might inadvertently set up for ourselves. And by we, I'm referring to those of us, i.e. myself included, who engage in releasing offensive tools and techniques. All right, so here's some rules, simple rules I'll lay out, or guidelines regarding offensive tools and technique releases. Oops, okay. So here we are acknowledging that there is the way we are doing things now, and that there exists a better way to go about releasing our offensive tools and techniques. So this is simply the acknowledgement that there is a better way. Next, I'm calling this out because if the decision is made to publicly release a tool or technique, we can't completely eliminate the risk of criminals using our work to facilitate evil. And considering we all have different ethical frameworks, it is important for there to be a universal consensus, it is impossible, for there to be a universal consensus on what is deemed right, quote unquote. Now, there may be a quote wrong way to release something, in the sense that if we do something in a fashion that directly benefits criminal use at the deliberate expense of improving security for, say, enterprise defenders and vendors, then I would hope that many would agree that there also exists a quote worse way to release tools and techniques from the way that we're doing it now. So this is a reaffirmation that the option to do better never ceases to exist. The extent to which we do a better job of releasing tools and techniques is bounded by our creativity, patience, and willingness to work harder than we already are. Finally, continuing with the status quo certainly is an enticing option because it doesn't require any additional work and it doesn't involve intentionally hurting anyone in the process. And then on the flip side, if we obsess about always getting everything perfectly right, we'll end up suffering from a quote analysis paralysis, where we spend more time pontificating what could be done in the pursuit of perfection than actually doing something. So we don't want to fall into either of those traps. Does anyone know who said this? So let's consider what's being said here. What I suspect is being said here is that there's an implicit justification to release offensive tools and techniques, because if we didn't make them public, there are already well-resourced adversaries abusing them, so how can defenders be given a fair shot at detecting something that they're blind to? So at the end of the day, transparency always wins, because at least with transparency, defenders have a choice in acting on it, right? Now, I think there's some merit to this argument, but it contains important omissions that I think we should consider. So this was me who said this back in 2015 at Black Hat Vegas. And this is a classic, the end justifies the means argument, where my implication here was that offensive researchers have a moral obligation to release tools and techniques as a means of exposing well-resourced actors who are operating with impunity. Now, the foundational assumption that this assertion is built upon is that, quote, someone has likely already done it. And I can tell you, at least anecdotally, from my personal experience, that this is not true. We're actually much brighter and creative than we like to give ourselves credit for, And in fact, downplaying our individual abilities is a common trap our egos will play on us for blindly justifying the release of offensive tools and techniques. Something which we should be very mindful of. So I think we need to do a better job of considering how our tool and technique releases comprise a, quote, public good, rather than releasing them first and justifying their release after the fact. So here's another trap I see us falling into a lot, certainly myself. So I believe a common ethical trap that we set up for ourselves is downplaying our skill and creativity while simultaneously overestimating the skills and creativity of many criminal actors. So again, I would ask that we strive to better identify when we downplay our work and our abilities as a justification for a tool or technique release. So I consider this assertion to be false. All right. So what are some potential biases that we may be blind to when justifying our tool or technique releases? This is a common trap I've certainly fallen into a lot. Excuse me. So, claiming an urgency in releasing a tool or technique is a trap that many of us will fall into. One reason would be that if we took the, quote, Simpsons already did it analogy at face value and didn't recognize that as a potential trap, well then every tool or technique release that we want to put out there should have a sense of urgency, since we're assuming that the capability is already actively being abused somewhere, and it is our moral imperative to stop that by leveling the playing field for everyone. Also, many of us are naturally impatient creatures, myself absolutely included, who crave the sense of accomplishment of putting something out there so that we can mentally move on to our next fun and sexier project. All right, so we all want to ensure that vendors are being held accountable and don't become complacent. That's pretty reasonable in my opinion. We have to realize though that vendors are not subject matter experts in your tools and techniques or in my tools and techniques. You are, or I am. And while we would love for vendors to eventually become those subject matter experts, that takes time. So my ask here is that we strive to be more patient and understanding of the challenges vendors face in trying to be subject matter experts of all the things. And also to occasionally remind ourselves that vendors are comprised of human people with human limitations. And also, what is, quote, quick enough? Is that is that an overly subjective observation based on a potentially overinflated sense of urgency based on the previous bullet that we just discussed? Something to consider. So vendors always have to weigh resilience of a detection against speed of detection. Fast but brittle detections catch a lot of evil despite the susceptibility to bypass. And most engineers who develop signatures will also readily acknowledge how brittle their signatures are. Again, speed is of the essence there. Ideally, a vendor will focus on short-term speed and long-term resilience, though. Those aren't mutually exclusive. So if you feel the need to say this, and I offer this because I've said this myself, 1, are you sure your conscience is actually clear? And 2, are you admitting that there are no further improvements to be made? I leave that to you to decide if that's something that that you've said or would consider saying when challenged. All right, so some things to consider that happen when a tool or technique is released. So it should go without saying that every tool and technique release presents the opportunity for everyone to collectively learn and shine a light on previous blind spots that attackers may or may not be actively abusing. So I do not want to downplay the tremendous value that offensive tools and techniques offer the greater community. A new tool or technique is unlikely to be detected by most security solutions, right? So this is a massive power that the person releasing the tool or technique wields. So in other words, what you've created flies under the radar of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Acknowledging that power that you wield, you have a choice of using it for good. And lastly, I think this is an important point. There's always a race between criminal weaponization and detection. And that race starts immediately upon something being released publicly. And so again, you being the subject matter expert of your tool and technique, you have the power to arm vendors, enterprise defenders, and the broader community with as much information and transparency as possible to make their jobs as easy as possible. All right. Too often, I see no attempt made to establish a set of criteria for releasing an offensive tool or technique. Attempting such a thing, I believe, is a good first step, because even if I were to develop a simple checklist and consider it to be relatively immature, that's okay. So I would ask you to consider the following: that you consider or establish a set of conditions under which you would, say, release a new offensive tool, update an existing offensive tool, whether it's your tool or someone else's out there, describe and release a new or novel technique, or supply evasion guidance to an existing technique. All of these scenarios could potentially have their own respective set of conditions, or literally like just checkboxes that you could check where you're doing your due diligence, that if any of those conditions are not met, then you haven't met the bar that you've set yourself for a release. So remember, we're striving for better, not perfect. And even a weak checklist with boxes unchecked would give us a more obvious reason to hold off on releasing something until those conditions were met. So consider making that simple checklist. Now some additional considerations. All right. So don't necessarily introduce deliberate detection artifacts, but when high signal artifacts are discovered, consider not altering them in your public repository. It's easy enough to change them in an internal repository. Right? So I consider this to be a way in which we're either indirectly or directly lowering the cost to attackers by offering free signature evasion to anyone who wants it. Now, as a pen tester or red teamer who's trying to offer value internally to one of your customers, obviously evasion is one of your primary goals. Well, one of your primary goals is to achieve objectives, ideally without getting caught, because that would inhibit you achieving your objectives. So perhaps consider having in your initial public release to just introduce new features without necessarily introducing new evasions for the features that you're introducing in your public version, and to reserve those particular signature evasions for your internal version. Next would be just to try to put yourself in the shoes of an incident responder, scoping and remediating an incident where your tool or technique was used. So how would they find your tool or technique in a compromised environment? You know your tools and techniques best, so in theory, you should be in a position to offer the most actionable guidance, even if the answer is, quote, after looking long and hard for practical ways to detect or mitigate this, I found nothing, but here's the list of things I considered that I don't consider to be fruitful, so that you can quickly validate yourself before moving on to other potential avenues of detection. So continuing the theme of the language we use matters, what I have found, what I found is that how we label our tool or technique initially could really influence its design, its perception, its primary consumers, and whether it's so like for example, like those consumers being primarily defenders or some other group like pen tester or a red teamer. As someone releasing an offensive capability, the question I pose to you and to me is, why do we tend to default having pen testers and red teamers as our primary intended consumers? Does that always have to be the case? So maybe if we could consider reframing what we call our tools, that could perhaps dictate our architecture design of things. So I put this out there a while ago, where at the time, the only thing I was considering was simply the label of our tooling, not necessarily how that label would influence the design. So this is more of we release an offensive tool and we simply market it as an auditing tool. I had not considered that applying such a label from the onset could influence the target consumer and design, where marketing only scratches the surface. So like my intent here was, if you initially market your tool as an auditing tool, then perhaps you won't be so quickly setting the stage for your tool to be flagged by antivirus and other security products so early on, or if at all. What I encourage us to consider is, if a tool with an offensive capability is to be released, can it be designed in such a way where defenders are the primary consumer? So some considerations. You, as the creator of a tool or technique, are in control of the criteria or measurements that dictate success for the respective consumer of your work. But considering pen testers and red teamers have distinct objectives from enterprise defenders and security vendors, now there may be some overlap, but I consider their objectives to be distinct from one another. How do you design and communicate your tool? How you design and communicate it will tend to benefit one consumer over another. And I'm not advocating for having one primary consumer, say red teamers, over another, like defenders. I'm just saying there are options available to you. All right, so some additional design considerations. So if what we're developing, we're labeling as an offensive tool, where the primary consumer is like a pen tester or a red teamer, what we're designing is a capability that should ideally be modular in order to perform evasion. Again, because one of our objectives, say as a red teamer, is to simply achieve customer objectives, which involves gaining access to various components in an environment, where evasion is a priority for us. Because getting caught inhibits our ability to achieve our objective. Versus if we're designing an auditing tool from the offset, instead of designing a capability to facilitate achieving a red teamer's objective, instead you could think of it that we're just designing a test that should be modular in order to increase coverage, or like detection coverage. So for example, in the case of developing an auditing tool, either you observe the attack, or sorry, so like a test, kind of by definition, should be designed with certain pass-fail criteria. So for example, either you observe the attack technique being tested, or you don't. But in order to make such a pass-fail assertion, your test must have an expected consistent output. So when we're developing offensive tools where the primary consumer is a red teamer, both the tool and the techniques employed should evade detection, versus an auditing tool has the luxury of the audit tool itself as being distinct from what it's testing. Right? So like if you have like a testing framework that automates the testing of certain attack techniques, you're afforded as the developer the ability to not care about evasion in your tool. But meanwhile, instead of thinking about evasion in the attack techniques that you're developing, you're just thinking of different like inputs or use cases for that attack technique. So in designing a proper offensive tool where red teamers are the primary consumer, we must be mindful to introduce the minimum set of forensic artifacts in the interest of evasion, whereas in designing an auditing tool where defenders are the primary consumer, we have the privilege to highlight the relevant telemetry. So keyword being highlight the relevant telemetry that would allow a defender to more easily distinguish between the attack technique being employed and the particular artifacts of the audit tool itself. All right, so wrapping things up, I just like to reiterate that there's always a better way to do offensive tool technique and tool releases. But this requires us accepting that this may require additional patience, work, and creativity. Now, abstaining from releasing something is always an option, but rather than focusing on but I would rather us focus on establishing a set of criteria for abstinence, considering the benefit I think offensive tools offer. My preference is to focus on establishing a set of criteria for release, where if that criteria is met, where if that criteria is not met, then you have not established a sufficiently valid justification for a public release. So that abstinence is implicit, it's not explicit. Like we're striving to release something, but if we don't meet the bar that we set for ourselves, then we'll just hold off. Because we're striving to be more patient in the process and holding ourselves more accountable. And by, quote, better, I'm referring to specifically increasing the value to defenders while ideally reducing the value and or raising the cost to criminals. So lastly, just want to thank a few people and groups of people out there. So I'm here primarily as a result of being in opposition to messaging that has caused division within our industry. Like I have taken personal issue with things and I've had to work through many of my personal feelings in arriving to where I am now, offering this guidance to you. And I'm here because of you, those who have caused that division, or at least my perception of division within our community. But I'm grateful for you, and I respect your passion for your cause. Now, to be clear, I'm not condoning or advocating poor messaging. Instead, I'm pointing out that it can be used to highlight the critical need for more compassionate, thoughtful, and inclusive speech. So it's the indirect highlighting of that need that I'm deeply grateful for, and also the passion that underlies the important messages that we're trying to deliver, which is far too easy for all of us, admittedly, to deliver in a poor, sometimes divisive fashion. Lastly, I want to give a shout out to Matt Johnson and Kyle Andrus for offering me this platform. So grateful for you. This is definitely a rather unique talk for me. Kind of goes against the grain of what I'm used to doing and presenting like highly technical content. So again, thank you. And yeah, I just wanted to explicitly say it because it's often hard for us to do it, but I really do love you all, and I mean that genuinely. So again, thank you for your time. And with that, I will open the floor to questions.
Yes, and I'm gathering those questions right now for you. And thank you very much. Thank you for speaking today and on this topic in particular.
Yeah.
I know it's something that's kind of sensitive in our community. A couple of comments so far. One, that this has been one of the best talks on communication that I've seen in a long time. We have another one that came in that Matt is a great example of how our community can grow and be better. We also have a comment from our Discord server. While it has not, while it was not technical, it points out a big issue in our community and how we communicate. Me being one who need to do a better job at this, using we instead of you makes so much more sense. Thanks, Matt. This was a much needed talk. There is one question on if these slides will be available later.
Yes. Yeah, I'll definitely make them available whenever. Well, is the YouTube link going to be like persistent?
Yes, this YouTube link should be the same, and it'll be stored as soon as the stream ends.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so my plan will be to offer the slide deck as a PDF alongside the YouTube link. My preference would be that anyone wanting to consume this in the future, listen to me drone through all this because I think I offer some context that the slides might miss out on. But I'll certainly have both options available.
Okay, and then there's a couple comments from Twitter. One, Katie Nichols mentioned that thoughtful reflections like this are one of the many reasons why Matt is so awesome. So good, this should be required viewing for anyone on Twitter.
Thank you, Katie.
A quick comment from Olaf Hartong. Sorry if I kill anyone's last name during the next 2 days. Great keynote, great life lessons and humility and respect. Totally agree with this. We need to do better as a community. And with that, I don't have any other questions currently pending. But I can relay them to you. If anyone sends them after the fact, I'll make sure they get to you.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I'll hang out in Discord for a while. So if any more questions come up that would like to be a little more private in nature, I'm certainly open to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. For everyone else in the stream, our next talk is going to be at 11:30. It's going to be the Insider Threat, the MySec podcast. They will be covering, hosting a panel of current and previous Michigan security startups. So there's a link that's been posted out on our website, convergeconference.org. Also on Twitter, and we have a Discord channel where we're hosting all of our communications. And with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks again, Matt.
Thank you. Take care.